Okay, I'm back. Dinner's done, so let's get started. So the BFG just said that he can hear the dreams because of his great big ears. Is you seeing these? He asked. How could I miss them? Sophie said. They may look a bit preposterous to you, the BFG said, but you must believe me when I say they is extra very unusual ears. They is not to be coughed at. I'm sure they're not, Sophie said. They is allowing me to hear absolutely every single twiddly little thing. You mean you can hear things I can't hear? You as deaf as a dumpling compared to me, cried the BFG. You was hearing only thumping loud noises with those little earwigs of yours. But I am hearing all the secret whisperings of this world. Such as what? In your country, he says, I is hearing the footsteps of a ladybird as she goes walking across a leaf. Honestly? What's more, I is hearing those footsteps very loud. When a ladybird is walking across a leaf, I is hearing her feet go clumpity-clump-clump like giant footsteps. Good gracious me, what else can you hear? I is hearing little ants chittering to each other as they scuttle around the soil. You can hear ants talking? Every single word, the BFG said, although I is not exactly understanding their language. Go on. Sometimes, on a very clear night, and if I is swiggling my ears in just the right direction, and here he was swiveling his great ears upwards, so they were facing the ceiling. If I is swiggling them like this, and the night is very clear, I is sometimes hearing far away music coming from the sky. A queer little shiver passed through Sophie's body. She sat very quiet, waiting for more. My ears told me that you was watching me out of your window last night. But I didn't make a sound, Sophie said. I was hearing your heart beating across the road, the BFG said, loud as a drum. Go on, please. I can hear plants and trees. Do they talk? Sophie asked. They is not exactly talking, the BFG said, but they is making noises. For instance, if I come along and I is picking a lovely flower, when I is twisting the stem of the flower till it breaks, the plant is screaming. I can hear it screaming and screaming very clear. You don't mean it, Sophie cried. How awful. It is screaming just like you if someone comes and twists your arm off. Is that really true? Sophie asked. You think I is swizz-figgling you? It is rather hard to believe. Then I is stopping right here, the BFG said sharply. I is not wishing to be called a fibster. Oh no, I'm not calling you anything, Sophie cried. I believe you, I do, really. Please go on. The BFG gave her a long, hard stare. Sophie looked right back at him, her face open to his. I believe you, she said softly. She had offended him. She could see that. I wouldn't ever be fibbling to you. I know you wouldn't, Sophie said, but you must understand it isn't easy to believe such amazing things straight away. I understand that, the BFG said. He waited a while longer, and then he said, It is the same with trees and flowers. If I is chopping an axe into the trunk of a big tree, I is hearing a terrible sound coming from the heart of the tree. What sort of sound? A soft, moaning sound. It is the sound an old man is making when he is slowly dying. He paused. The cave was very silent. Trees is living and growing just like you and me, he said. They is alive. So is plants. He was sitting very straight in his chair now, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His face was bright, his eyes round and bright as two stars. Such wonderful and terrible things I is hearing. Some of them you would never wish to be hearing yourself, but some is like glorious music. He seemed almost to be transfigured by the excitement of his thoughts. His face was beautiful in its blaze of emotions. "Tell me more about them," Sophie said quietly. "You ought to be hearing little miceys talking," the BFG said. "Oh, what did they say?" Sophie asked. "Only miceys know that," he said. "Spiders is also talking a great big deal. You might not be thinking about spiders. You might not be thinking it, but spiders is the most tremendous natterboxes. And when they is spinning their webs, they is singing all the time. They is singing sweeter than nightingales." "What else do you hear?" Sophie asked. "One of the biggest chat boxes is the cattle piddlers." "What do they say?" "Oh, they is arguing all the time about who's going to be the prettiest buttery fly. That's all they is ever talking about." "Is a dream floating in here now?" The BFG moved his great ears this way and that. He shook his head. "No dream in here," he said, "except in the bottles. I has a special place to go for catching dreams. It's not often coming to giant country." "How do you catch them?" "The same way you is catching buttery flies," the BFG answered, "with a net." He stood up and crossed over to a corner of the cave where a pole was leaning against the wall. The pole was about 30 feet long, and there was a net at the end of it. "Here is my dream catcher," he said, grasping the pole in one hand. "Every morning I is going out and snitching new dreams to put in my bottle." Suddenly, he seemed to lose interest in the conversation. "I is getting hungry," he said. "It's time for eats." The next chapter, Snozcumbers. "But if you don't eat people like all the others," Sophie said, "then what do you live on?" "That is a squelching tricky problem round here," the BFG answered. "In this slosh-funkling giant country, happy eats like pineapples and pig winkles is simply not growing. Nothing is growing except one extremely icky-poo vegetable, the snozcumber." "The snozcumber? There is no such thing," said Sophie. The BFG looked at Sophie and smiled, showing 20 of his square white teeth. "Yesterday," he said, "we is not believing in giants, is we? Just because we happen to not have actually seen something with our own two little winkles, we think it is not existing? What about, for instance, the great squizzly Scotch hopper?" "I beg your pardon?" "And the humplecrimp?" "What's that?" "And the rap rascal?" "The what?" "And the crumpscottle." "Are they animals?" Sophie asked. "They is common animals," said the BFG. "I is not a very know-all giant myself, but it seems to me that you is absolutely a know-nothing human whose brain is full of rotten wool." "You mean cotton wool?" Sophie said. "What I mean and what I say are two different things," the BFG announced. "I will now show you a snozcumber." The BFG flung open a massive cupboard and took out the weirdest-looking thing Sophie had ever seen. It was about half as long as an ordinary man, but much thicker. It was black and white stripes along its length, and it was covered all over with coarse knobbles. "Here is the repulsant snozcumber," cried the BFG, waving it. "I squoggle it. I mispise it. I desponge it. But because I is refusing to gobble human beings, I must spend my life guzzling these icky-poo snozcumbers instead. If I don't, I will be nothing but skin and groans." "You mean skin and bones?" Sophie said. "I know it is skin and bones," the BFG said, "but please understand, I cannot be helping if sometimes my words is a little squiggly. I is trying my best all the time." The BFG suddenly looked so forlorn that Sophie got upset. "I'm sorry," Sophie said. "I didn't mean to be rude." "There was never any schools to teach me talking in giant country," the BFG said. "But couldn't your mother have taught you?" "My mother!" cried the BFG. "Giants don't have mothers. Surely you's knowing that." "I did not know that." Who ever heard of a woman giant? Said the BFG, waving the snozzcumber over his head like a lasso. There is never a woman giant, and never will there be one. Giants is always men. Sophie felt herself getting a little muddled. In that case, how were you born? Giants isn't born, the BFG answered. Giants appears, and that is all there is to it. They simply appears the same way as sun and stars. And when did you appear? Sophie asked. Now how on earth could I be knowing a thing like that? Said the BFG. It was so long ago I couldn't count. You mean you don't even know how old you are? No giant is knowing that. All I know is I is very, very old and crumply, perhaps as old as earth. What happens when a giant dies? Sophie asked. Giants is never dying, the BFG answered. Sometimes, and quite suddenly, a giant is disappearing, and no one is ever knowing where he goes to. But mostly us giants is simply going on and on like whiffsy time twiddlers. The BFG was still holding the awesome snozzcumber in his right hand, and now he put one end in his mouth and bit off a huge hunk of it. He started crunching it up, and the noise he made was like crunching lumps of ice. Ugh! It's filthy, he sputtered, speaking with his mouth full and spraying large pieces of snozzcumber like bullets in Sophie's direction. Sophie hopped up on the tabletop, ducking out of the way. Ugh! Disgusterous! Puh, sickable! It's rotsome! It's maggot-wise! Try it yourself, this filthsome snozzcumber. No, thank you, Sophie said, backing away. It's all right. You're going to be used to guzzling. It's all you're going to be guzzling around here, so you might as well get used to it, said the BFG. Go on, you snipsy little winkle. Have a go. Sophie took a small nibble. Ugh! She sputtered. Oh, no! Oh, gosh! She spat it out quickly. It tastes like frog skins and rotten fish. Worse than that, cried the BFG, roaring with laughter. To me it is tasting of clock cloaches and slime wranglers. Do we really have to eat this? You do, unless you is wanting to be so thin you be disappearing into thick air. Into thin air, Sophie said. Once again that sad, winsome look came into the BFG's eyes. Ugh, words, he said, is oh such a tickling problem to me all my life. So you must simply try to be patient and stop squibbling. As I'm telling you before, I know exactly what words I is wanting to say, but somehow or other they is always getting squiddled around. That happens to everyone, Sophie said. Not like it happens to me, the BFG said. I is speaking the most terrible Wigglish. I think you speak beautifully. You do? The BFG said. You really do? Simply beautifully, Sophie repeated. Well, that is the nicest present anybody has ever given in my whole life, cried the BFG. Are you sure you was not twiddling my leg? Of course not, Sophie said. I love the way you talk. How wondercrump, said the BFG, still beaming. How whoopsie splunkers. How absolutely squiffling. I is all of a stutter. Listen, Sophie said, we don't have to eat snozzcumbers. In the field in our village there are all sorts of lovely vegetables like cauliflower and carrots. Why don't you get some next time you're visiting? BFG raised his head proudly in the air. I is a very honorable giant, he said. I would rather be chewing up rotsome snozzcumbers than snitching things from other people. You stole me, Sophie said. I did not steal you very much, said the BFG, smiling gently. After all, you was just one tiny little girl. All right. We'll pick up next time with a chapter called The Blood Bottler.